Eleanor Vance was 27 years old, and her life in Port Blossom felt like a ship stuck on the mudflats at low tide. This small, forgotten coastal town had salt in its air and despair in its bones. I was a ghost haunting the docks, watching the few remaining fishing boats come in, remembering when our family's trawlers, the Vance's Tide, filled the harbor with their bounty. I used to laugh, my hands raw from gutting fish, the smell of the sea a perfume. I was supposed to inherit the business, the oldest, most respected seafood operation in Port Blossom, a legacy that stretched back 3 generations. I had a mind for numbers and a heart for the ocean, always believing I could bring new life to the old ways. My distinctive quality was my unwavering loyalty, especially to my father, a kind man who taught me everything. He had a big laugh and an even bigger heart, always believing in the good in people, a fatal flaw in a town like ours. Everything changed 5 years ago when Silas Croft, a man my father had taken under his wing as a young boy, a man he treated like a son, systematically dismantled us. Silas was sharp, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. My father had trusted him with the books, with new expansion plans, everything. Silas manipulated contracts, siphoned funds, and eventually, through a series of legal maneuvers that looked legitimate on paper but felt like theft in my soul, he took everything. Our processing plant, our fleet, even our ancestral home that was tied up as collateral for a loan Silas had arranged, it all became his. My father, broken and betrayed, died a year later, his spirit crushed, leaving me with nothing but a mountain of debt and the crushing weight of his legacy, or what was left of it. I was unsatisfied with merely surviving. I saw Silas Croft every day, his new, flashy processing plant now standing where ours once did, his expensive car speeding through the cobbled streets. He even bought the old Vance family home, turning it into some kind of garish summer rental. He was my nemesis, the architect of my family's destruction and my own living nightmare. I yearned for justice, for a way to make him understand what he had done. I tried everything to fight back, legally at first. I spent months poring over old documents, trying to find a loophole, a hidden clause, anything that could prove Silas's treachery. I drained my meager savings on a small-town lawyer who just shook his head, explaining how Silas had covered every track, how everything was technically legal. I even confronted Silas once, right on the docks, begging him to at least acknowledge the pain he'd caused. He just laughed, a cold, dry sound that scraped against my ears, and told me to move on, Eleanor, the tide changes. That moment solidified something dark inside me. My legal battles failed. My pleas for humanity were met with scorn. I tried to start my own small venture, a little crabbing boat, but Silas, with his control over the docks and supply lines, made sure I couldn't get a fair price for my catch or even proper access to the best berths. He sent his men to accidentally damage my traps, cutting my lines. The problem wasn't just Silas thriving, it was him actively stifling any attempt I made to rebuild. The town, once our friends and employees, now looked away, fearful of Silas's power. I felt isolated, a pariah in my own home. Desperation clawed at me. One night, I found myself outside his new processing plant, a wrench in my hand, thinking of doing something stupid, something destructive. But then I remembered my father's honesty, his unwavering integrity. I couldn't become a common criminal, not like Silas. I needed something more poetic, something that would hit him where it hurt most. His pride, his reputation, his false sense of untouchable power. It was then, as a storm gathered offshore, battering the docks with heavy rain and wind, that a new, chilling idea began to form. I started spending nights in the old, derelict Vance canning facility, the one part of the property Silas hadn't bothered to develop, deeming it too old and contaminated. I called it my workshop now, a place where I could think, plan, and create. It was damp, smelled of rust and decaying fish, but it was mine. I researched everything about the local seafood market, about Silas's operations, his clients, his distribution network. I learned about obscure marine toxins, about the delicate balance of the ocean's ecosystem, and more importantly, about its vulnerabilities. I felt like a spider weaving a web, intricate and deadly, but the more I delved, the more dangerous my path became. I realized the true depth of Silas's reach, his influence stretching far beyond Port Blossom. He had politicians in his pocket, health inspectors who looked the other way, and a network of distributors who didn't care where the fish came from as long as it was cheap. It felt impossible to touch him without destroying myself. I hit rock bottom, staring at a bottle of cheap whiskey in the gloom of the old factory, contemplating giving up, leaving port blossom forever, letting Silas win completely. But then I saw my father's old fishing knife, rusting on a workbench, and a flash of his kind, broken face. I couldn't abandon him again. The thought ignited a cold fury, a resolve so strong it burned away my doubt. If I couldn't beat him in the light, I would drag him into the darkness. I would use his own greed, his own industry, against him. My plan was intricate, born of sleepless nights and a chilling determination. It involved the ocean itself, the very thing that had sustained our family for generations, now a tool for my vengeance. Silas's biggest pride was his Blue Wave Select brand, premium oysters and scallops, ethically sourced, he claimed, from his own controlled beds just offshore. These beds were actually a mix of his, and some he had subtly annexed from smaller, struggling fishermen. I knew the area like the back of my hand, every current, every hidden reef. For months, under the cover of the darkest nights, I had been working. I started cultivating a specific type of naturally occurring bioluminescent plankton, harmless in small doses, but when concentrated, it could give off a faint, eerie glow. More importantly, I had found a way to introduce a non-toxic but distinctly unpleasant flavor into the water of a specific tidal pool that fed directly into one of Silas's oyster beds during certain moon phases. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but with repeated exposure, the shellfish would absorb it. My final act was the distribution. I didn't want to kill anyone, just ruin Silas. I timed my move to coincide with his biggest annual shipment, a multi-million-dollar order for high-end restaurants across the state. Using my old, barely seaworthy crabbing boat, the Sea Ghost, I navigated to the precise coordinates, the ones my father had shown me for the hidden channels and strong currents. I released the concentrated plankton, a shimmering, otherworldly cloud that pulsed with a faint, ghostly blue light under the dark water, directly into the intake pumps of Silas's automated purification system, along with the source of the peculiar taste. It was a silent invasion. I knew the plankton would disperse quickly, leaving no trace by morning, but the flavor would already be embedded in the oysters and scallops, and the faint glow would be evident under specific conditions, like when they were shucked in a dimly lit kitchen. The horror wasn't in poison, but in something far more insidious. A taint, a haunting. The days that followed were a blur of anxious waiting. Then, the whispers started. First, complaints from high-end chefs about a strange, metallic aftertaste in Silas's Blue Wave Select oysters. Then, the truly unnerving reports. Tiny, almost imperceptible flashes of pale blue light emanating from some of the shucked shellfish, especially in dark restaurant environments. It wasn't dangerous, but it was horrifyingly unnatural. The internet exploded with videos. Ghost oysters from Port Blossom. Is your seafood haunted? Silas tried to deny it, blaming competitors, but the consistency of the reports, always tied to his brand, quickly decimated his reputation. Health inspectors found nothing toxic, nothing illegal, but the public perception was irreversible. Who wanted to eat seafood that glowed with an unearthly light and tasted faintly of brine and something vaguely industrial, even if it was technically safe? His multi-million-dollar orders were canceled. Distributors pulled his products. Lawsuits piled up not for poisoning, but for breach of contract, for damaged brand reputation, for the pure psychological horror of it. Silas Croft, the man who built an empire on lies, watched it crumble under the weight of a spectral glow and an phantom taste. He went from being the town's undisputed king to its laughingstock, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, paranoid fear. He saw ghosts where there were none, suspected sabotage everywhere, but could never prove a thing. He sold off his businesses at fire sale prices, desperate to escape the haunted brand, eventually leaving Port Blossom a broken man, just as my father had been. I watched him go from the old canning factory, the Sea Ghost bobbing gently in the harbor behind me. Port Blossom slowly started to heal, the town finding its footing again without Silas's suffocating presence. Smaller fishermen found their voice, and the docks slowly regained some of their old life. I reopened the Vance's Tide, a much smaller operation, but honest and thriving. My hands, once raw from revenge, were now raw from honest work. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years, a quiet satisfaction. But the twist, the truly chilling part, wasn't about Silas. It was about me. Sometimes, late at night, when the moon was just right and the tide was low, I still found myself at the edge of the water, a faint, almost imperceptible blue glow lingering on my fingertips after I touched the sea. And sometimes, when I tasted the fresh oysters from my own small beds, I swore I could detect, deep within the briny flavor, the barest whisper of that peculiar, haunting taste. The ocean had taken part of Sela's, and in turn, it had indelibly marked me. The vengeance was complete, but I was no longer just a leaner Vance. I was something more, something connected to the deep, dark secrets of the sea, forever carrying a faint echo of the horror I had unleashed.